right, so let's go ahead and get started. We're just a few minutes past the hour. So welcome back, everybody. We have now crossed the halfway mark of this year's language documentation series. So welcome to week 5. We're going to be talking about sociolinguistic documentation. So let's start with what exactly are we even talking about today? Well, we can kind of get some clues from the term sociolinguistics itself. We know we've been here talking about linguistics, so what's this socio part? Well, that means social. And so the eminent sociolinguist Walt Wolfram offered the following definition. Language use symbolically represents fundamental distinctions of social behavior and human interaction. The notion is simple, but the ways in which language reflects behavior can often be complex and subtle. Okay, that wasn't very simple after all. So let's simplify it a little bit more so that we can all be on the same page. So sociolinguistics is the study of how language use represents, interacts with, and also affects social structures, right? So let's make it as simple as possible. How we talk is a result of who we are and how we fit into society, and vice versa, right? Who we are and how we talk and our place in the social world are all linked together, and all these things affect each other reciprocally. So when we study that, we are doing sociolinguistics. And just to say, this is a gigantic subfield of linguistics. We could spend years and years studying sociolinguistics. So today is just going to be a tiny sample of some of the ways that you can bring sociolinguistics into your language documentation work. If you're interested in some good introductory textbooks to sociolinguistics overall, there's some links here in the slides that you can check out afterwards. All right, so I want to take us all the way back to week 1. If anybody remembers week 1, when we first defined language documentation, and we called it creating a lasting multi-purpose record of a language. Maybe some of y'all remember that. Maybe you're all looking closely at the slides each week to remind yourselves, but maybe not. That's okay, because I want to actually update that definition. I want to go back and add some stuff to it. So we started out with just creating a lasting multi-purpose record of a language. Let's actually shift that over to how Nicholas Himmelman defined language documentation in his his 1998 paper that many people point to as starting the new subfield of language documentation. What he actually described it as was creating a comprehensive record of the linguistic practices characteristic of a given speech community, right? And the way this is phrased has some pretty big implications for how we do language documentation, because this means we're not just looking at a language, right? We don't have to only focus on one language. And even doing that would require us to define what a language is, which is hard enough. That can be pretty complicated. So we can zoom out and focus on multiple languages. And we're not just looking at linguistic structure, right? We're not just looking at how sounds are used or patterned. We're not just looking at how words are formed. We're not looking at the structure of sentences. We're looking beyond all that at other things in addition to the structure of languages. In fact, this means we can zoom all the way out and document all of the stuff that people do with language. And this includes all of the different languages they use and all of the varieties of those different languages. And if we're feeling really, really ambitious and we want to go very deep into it, we might also try and look at why people use languages in the ways that they do. So we're going to talk today about some of the ways we can start documenting all this really complicated stuff in the social realm. So some of the why we do this. The field of sociolinguistic documentation is pretty new within language documentation more broadly and within sociolinguistics. And I think a lot of people would point to a 2012 workshop at the University of Buea in Cameroon that really kind of got this subfield moving, right? Previously, people were looking very closely at language and social structures within fields like linguistic anthropology or sociology of language. But within kind of the narrow disciplinary boundaries of language documentation, there was a little bit less focus on sociolinguistic questions. But then Dr. Tucker Childs, one of my mentors, and Jeff Good and several other folks put together this really meaningful workshop on sociolinguistic documentation that led to a paper published in 2014 called, oh shoot, I believe it's called Towards a Theory of Sociolinguistic Documentation. But the basic message here was that, right, language documentation is often done when there is a danger that languages are being lost, are being not spoken anymore, and people tend to focus on those urgent endangerment situations when they're doing documentation. But it's actually language ecologies, right? These complex systems of how languages interact with each other, how they interact with people and places. Language ecologies are actually more fragile and more endangered than individual languages, right? Those ecologies tend to be disrupted or disappear before languages themselves do. And that means it's especially urgent and important to document those systems of how languages relate to each other and those ways that language interacts with social structures. And I know this all sounds pretty heady. This is all kind of abstract. Don't worry, we're going to bring it back to specifics. But I just wanted to give some credit to the folks who really got this thinking moving in language documentation in the last decade or so. And again, this just sociolinguistic documentation, the way it's been growing over the last decade, is a really big topic. So we're going to do a sample today. So here are three of the things we're going to focus on when we're talking about sociolinguistic documentation. First, a really important one, multilingualism, right? What are the languages people are using in a given community or a context, right? And how are they using those different languages? Then we're also going to look at variation, which means the differences in how different people talk. And finally, we're going to talk a little bit about language attitudes and ideologies, which is in the abstract, what people believe and think and feel about language use and also about specific languages. And I like this photo because it kind of shows how complicated all of this is me having a conversation with Sharma Molongwa in Campo in Cameroon. And I'm asking him all these very abstract questions about like, well, what are your language ideologies and how do they relate to what languages you use in a given day? And he's just like, whoa, just like looking very thoughtfully, trying to get a hold on all of the complexities around how language use works. It was a very abstract and fun conversation. And I think both of our minds were blown a lot during this conversation. So, if we are talking about multilingualism, I think this is probably a familiar term, at least to a lot of folks working with language. But just to bring it back to the basics, this is when we study what languages are used by either communities or by individuals, and also how those languages are used. And so we might ask questions like, what languages does a person know, right? An individual person, what languages do they understand? What languages do they speak? How did they learn them? How do they use them? Or theoretically, if two people in a given community who have different mother tongues, however you want to define that, if two people with different languages meet, which languages are they going to use together? This is a really important question in a lot of language endangerment contexts. And also, what social roles does each language in the community fill, right? What roles does that language play for the individual, and what roles does that language play in the broader community? And finally, what emotional or psychological or spiritual or other kinds of meanings do different languages have in a given community, right? In multilingual communities, languages often have different uh, not baggage, but they have different meaning attached to them in a lot of cases. So how do we look at what that meaning is for each of those languages? So, for example, from my own research, when I was doing my PhD, one of my big questions was the linguistic ecology of one specific town, right? What is the linguistic ecology? What are the languages being used? How do they relate to each other? How do people navigate their daily lives with all these different languages in the mix? And I wanted to understand that to have a better understanding of what was happening around the endangerment of one of those languages, Yasa. And so I wanted to know, what are the languages that people speak here? Who speaks them? What do they use them for, right? Like, what do people speak in the market? What do they choose to do when they're talking to their family? What language would you start out with when you talk to a taxi driver, right? What language do you use if you want to sound really important? What language do you use if you're just joking around? These are all questions about the linguistic ecology and people's daily lives. And just useful piece of terminology, the situations and the parts of life that a language is used in are called its domains of use. When you are reading academic writing about language endangerment, you'll hear a lot about domains of use. So I'm curious for all of y'all, what is multilingualism like in your communities? And I invite you to kind of reflect on these questions during this session. And if you have some questions or thoughts, drop them in the chat. So these are questions like, what languages do you know and use? What languages do your family and neighbors and friends know and use? What roles do those languages play, right? That could be literal roles like, okay, I have to go to the hospital in this language. Or it could be symbolic roles, right? Like I use this language when I'm trying to sound super serious. Or maybe, right, maybe Arabic is the language that you associate with like education and knowledge, but your mother tongue is the one you would use if you were trying to create warmth or comfort for somebody else, right? And then questions about where each language is used or can be used. Can you shop at the store in each of the languages you know? Can you speak them at the hospital or at the post office? What do you use when you're posting on social media? And what does this tell you as you reflect on that about the language's social roles in your daily life, right? What kind of symbolic meaning or roles do those languages play in your life? All right, so that's multilingualism. And again, I know this is all a lot, so we'll come back to it for questions. Feel free to drop them in the chat or ask at the end. But let's get to variation, our second topic, because this is essentially the study of how different people talk differently, if we're going to put it in the simplest possible way. So, just a little exercise. This might only make sense to folks from the US, but if you can see a difference here, let me know. How do you see the two people who make these two different statements? So, statement one is, I'm fixing to wash my car over yonder in the hollow, which is how perhaps my grandpa or my grandpa's family would have said the following sentence: I'm preparing to go wash my car over there in the valley. So, who do you think these two people are that would say these two different sentences? What do you perceive about them? How do you see them? I'm just going to give it a second in the chat if anybody has any impressions of each person. Okay, I see. I thought the first person was British on the first read. Okay, fair enough. I think Appalachian English actually does have a lot in common with archaic British speech. Yeah. Um, I see some sentence one is speaking to the younger generation, and sentence two is more formal speech. Very interesting. Somebody said, I thought the first person Southern, but the way you say it sounds different. Yeah, I think that's also me being very long removed from my Appalachian roots. But also Appalachian English sounds a little different than other kinds of Southern English. Yeah. Some folks are saying formal and informal, could be some of that. First is like Black American. There are some overlaps, yeah, between a lot of like Appalachian English and Black English. Generation gaps. Yeah, these are all really great insights because these are all fundamentally things that tell you about the person in a social way, right? Yeah, I see regional, I see Southern. Yes, indeed. So all of these are different ways you can parse it, right? And theoretically, the first one is really more kind of a regional variation, right? It's a specific part of the southeastern US where you might find a variation like this. And the second one is sort of a more standardized formal English, right? Especially the way I said it. Um, but that's also something, those are two very different sentences, right? These are using different words, they're using quite different pronunciations, but they essentially mean the same thing. But let's make it even a smaller difference. What if there's only one word that's different in these sentences? What is the difference between these three sentences? For those of you in the US, or maybe this also reads to some of you outside of the US, what's the difference between would you grab me a pop? Would you grab me a soda? Would you grab me a Coke? What do we know about these three people based on what they're asking? I'm just going to see if we have any guesses in the chat. I see English variety, yep, regional variation. Yeah. See somebody there's that I know there are regional differences, but I don't know what they are actually. Uh-huh. Oh, I see a guess of formal and informal. Yeah, good guesses. Yep, I'm seeing yep, some suggestions that some of these might be like Philly versus Boston versus New York. I see another one that's English of UK versus Australia versus US. All right, you guys are honing in on the critical point that this has something to do with geography. This has something to do with where these people are from. Yeah, so for those of you thinking that this is something to do with where people are, bingo. So this is about where people are from. So when you hear each of these as a person in the US, you're like, aha, you must be from blah. So this is a fairly well-known map of the different words people use in the US for this fizzy, sweet drink. And if you see down here, the legend has like blue is soda territory. There are a couple other less used terms like tonic. I don't really actually know anyone who says tonic, but Coke is this red zone along the southern part of the country. And then pop, the other most common word, is sort of the whole top half of the country. And you'll see that soda also kind of extends over to the southwestern US, right? So when you hear somebody order this sweet fizzy drink in a restaurant, you can immediately make a bit of a guess about where they grew up in the US. And you'll also notice something really interesting, though. Even in these big green zones, we still have red dots where people say Coke. We still have blue dots where people say soda. And this is a really important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about variation, right? We can draw these really interesting big patterns, these general patterns. So if you were to say, like, yeah, people in the South in the US tend to call it a Coke, even if it's not a Coca-Cola, even if it's like a grape soda, they will call it a Coke. You can say that as a general rule of thumb, but there are always outliers and exceptions, and that's one of the most interesting things about variation. There's always somebody who does things a little bit differently than the folks around them. So the soda pop Coke map is one of the most iconic kind of regional variation maps for beginning sociolinguists. But it's not just words that can be different, and it's not just geography that can pattern those differences, right? So there can be variation in the words we use, like pop and soda and Coke, and we call this lexical variation. But there can also be differences in the same word, just pronounced different ways, right? I remember when I first moved from the East Coast of the US to the Midwest, I could not get over the checkout machine at the grocery store telling me to put my groceries in a bag. It sounded so funny to me because I'm used to saying bag, right? That's how we say it where I'm from, but over there they say bag. And I'm probably exaggerating a little bit, but it's the exact same word, meaning the exact same thing, spelled the exact same way, just with a difference in that vowel. And it really stuck out to me because it was so clearly regionally different. Same thing with grammar, right? people can use the same language with slightly different grammatical rules. So, I, as an American English speaker from kind of like the East Coast of the US, I can't really comfortably say the sentence, it needs washed, right? If something is dirty, I need to say, it needs to be washed. That's the natural way. That's how I feel comfortable saying that sentence. But people from other parts of the US or Canada might very comfortably say it needs washed, right? Some of my Canadian friends will say it needs washed. And something in my brain is like, that grammar is weird to me because that's not my American English. But it's the exact same meaning. It's the same language. It's just a slight different syntactic structure. Neither one is wrong. It's just which one comes naturally to you. Yeah, or I see in the UK, you also say it needs washing. Yeah, that one feels kind of like middlingly comfortable for me to say. It's not as strange to me as it needs washed. Um, and so when we're talking about people who talk a little bit differently, whether with words or sounds or grammar, this can relate to all kinds of things about that person. It can be their age, their gender, where they're from, where they live, their social identities, right? There's some really interesting sociolinguistic studies that show very small differences in social identities affect how you talk. There's a great study of a high school in the Midwest US where like the kids in different friend groups actually talked a little bit differently. They were from the same social class, they lived in the same place, but because some of them were like sports kids and some of them were like cool rock and roll kids, they actually started talking differently. Because what is language for? It's about showing who we are socially. So, language can also show your religious or political beliefs, right? There's a lot of studies about differences in US political voters and how they talk and pronounce things. It can also show kind of like your socioeconomic status, either right now or when you were growing up, right? So, all these tiny differences in how people talk clue us into all kinds of different categories of their identities, of their social presentations, of what they think and believe. It's great. So when we move out from language variation, we get something that interacts very closely with variation, right? When I was giving those different examples of, for example, standardized English versus Appalachian English, a lot of people's reactions to the Appalachian English example would also carry certain social judgments, and those come from their language attitudes and ideologies, right? Like, I know that when my dad was growing up, if he would not put on a standardized English accent, people would say, like, you sound dumb, you sound like a hillbilly, right? A lot of negative judgments around that kind of English. And that comes from language ideology. This is a really big topic that covers everything that people think and believe and feel about language in general, as well as specific languages or ways of using language, and also about people who speak a certain way, right? So when people would tell my dad, like, you sound like a hillbilly, that was part of their language ideology about people who use that kind of English. And so this sign is actually one of my favorite examples of language ideology, just bright and loud and in your face. This is a sign on the campus of the University of Buea in Cameroon. And it says, Pigeon is a lingua franca good only for non-academic environments. Do not use it on campus. So this is not even, you often have to dig and look for the subtleties of language ideology kind of coming through in the background. This sign just says it right up front. Pigeon is not good enough to be used on campus. And that is a very strong language ideology in a lot of contexts. And ideologies and attitudes can cover all kinds of questions that you might find interesting or relevant in your own documentation work, right? So this includes questions like, do people think of multilingualism as a strength or as a weakness? Do people believe that some languages are better or prettier or more ancient or more real or more logical or whatever? There's also a very important question in a lot of language revitalization contexts, which is who should speak a language and who counts as a real or a good or a legitimate or a true speaker. You can also ask questions about more abstract, large scale questions about language itself, right? Is a language something that lives in your brain neurology? Is it a social tool? Is it a living thing? Does it have a spirit, right? What is a language is a really important question in language ideology. Same thing with who does a language belong to and who is allowed to use it, or maybe even who is required to use it. There's a lot going on in a lot of places right now around legislating language and legislation around what languages you cannot use or languages you must use are all rooted in language ideology, right? Sometimes you'll hear the word ideology thrown around like, oh, this is a corrupting force that we must avoid. But at the end of the day, everything is based in ideology. Everyone has ideologies about language and about many other things. So the question is, what are they and how do we find out about them? So let's get into some actual concrete thoughts on how to do this kind of work, because I think that's what most of you are here for. So, how do we start out if we want to document multilingualism, right? If you want to look at patterns of languages being used in your community and how they are used, the first step I would definitely recommend always is observation. It's really hard to start doing research until you have some idea what's going on in your community. And this can look very simple. It can look like hanging out in public places and listening very closely to what people are speaking around you, as well as what are you seeing visually? What languages are used on signs, right? What are on official signs? What are on store signs? What are on like handwritten notes that people might leave on their lunch counter when they have to go take a break? And then what are the patterns of how those languages are being used? When people are talking to each other, are they staying in one language? Are they switching between languages? Who's using which of those languages, but also why do they seem to be using those languages? Are they being used for specific purposes, right? Is everybody buying and selling food in one language but making jokes in a different language? And why do you think that is? So I'd suggest when you're observing, definitely write down what you're seeing and noticing, but also be cautious about recording in public. People may not want to be recorded. It may not be legal. It may be against ethical norms where you are. So make sure you check in with what's allowed and what's acceptable and what's respectful where you are. If you are trying to get a little more concrete after doing some observation, surveys are a pretty cheap and easy next step in a lot of cases, especially if you're working by yourself or you have a pretty small team. Surveys are relatively easy to carry out on your own. And a survey sounds very formal, but all it means is you're asking the same set of questions to a bunch of different people, right? You pick a handful of questions that really identify what you're trying to find out, and you ask as many people as you can in roughly the same way. But surveys do work best if you already have a specific goal, if you already have a really good idea of what you're trying to find out. They're not a great exploratory tool. They're not always a great first step because by designing a survey, you have to start with a bunch of assumptions about what it is you're trying to find out. So start with observation first. And then once you have a better sense of what's going on in the community, you can design a survey. And surveys don't have to be written either. They can also be oral. They can also be you just like verbally asking people the same set of questions and recording what they say in some way. It can totally depend on your context, whether written surveys or oral surveys work better. A note of caution that in some communities, surveys can remind people of very bad history, right? Written documentation or censuses have been used to hurt people in some contexts, so people might be really cautious or nervous about doing surveys. So think about that before you get started with those. Then, once we have perhaps some idea about the languages being used, or maybe your interest is really in the different ways of using one particular language, we might want to look at documenting variation. And this is a really challenging and super interesting topic. It's one of my favorite areas of research. And it's also kind of a new area of research. There has been a lot of research into variation in big languages, right? There's tons of studies on English variation, like the pop soda Coke thing. But variation in indigenous and minoritized and endangered languages is much less well studied, and there's a lot of need for this kind of research if it's something that speaks to you. And there's a couple of books here in the slides that you can check out as well that have gathered together some really interesting studies in that field. But if you want to look at variation, especially if you're trying to answer a specific question like, you know, are there different dialects of my language that we should take into account in teaching materials, for example? The first thing you're going to need to do is figure out what exactly you're studying. Because if it's a really general question like, is there variation? Well, the answer is almost certainly yes. There's variation in basically every language. But then the question is, what is it and what does it mean? So the first thing to do is kind of some observation yet again. Have you ever noticed something like the pop soda Coke thing in your language, right? Does something spring to mind where you're like, oh yeah, people in that town say this, people in my town say this? Or maybe somebody has told you their own perceptions of variation in the language, like, oh yeah, for sure, young people say this, but older people say this. And a lot of people have really good intuitions about these kinds of differences in language. It's something that, in a lot of cases, people can identify and talk about, especially if you start asking them questions like, have you ever noticed that young people say blah? Most people will have very strong and voluminous opinions about how other people talk. But you'll want to identify the specific variable, right? So in the case of pop soda Coke, the word for fizzy drink is the variable, and that is the little thing that differs between people or between groups. You want to identify the variable that you're looking at. So these are some clues as to how to find variables that you could look at further. And so once you have an idea of what you want to look at, there are a lot of ways that you can get at it and start gathering information about how this variation patterns. So, one really common way to do it is to ask people to describe a silent movie or to describe a picture book that doesn't have any words in it, or maybe like a series of photographs, whatever works best for you. Because the goal here is you want to get people saying a bunch of similar things, and then you can look and find out if they're using different words or pronunciations or grammar, right? And so if you have everybody describe the same silent movie, they're all going to end up telling pretty similar stories about what's happening on the screen, but they might be using different words or pronunciations to do it. There's one called the pear story that's very common. It's about people picking pears out of pear trees, and it doesn't have any words. There's also a book called Frog, Where Are You? It has no words. It's about a kid who has a pet frog, and the frog escapes, and he goes to look for it, right? But there are lots of other materials that you can use that are out there to help people tell stories and use the words or the phrases you're looking for. You can also ask people just directly to read out loud from a word list. If you already know what words you're looking at, you can just put that word list in front of folks and say, can you read this out loud? Or if you're looking for lexical variation, you could also ask them to translate a word list. So if there's another shared language that most people in the community know, you could say like, oh, how do you translate the word soda, right? Or how do you translate, I don't know, motorcycle? Um, and finally, the other thing you can do, if you have a good grasp on the language, if you know the language pretty well, you can also record people's conversations, right, with their consent, of course, or you can do interviews with people where they're just talking about random stuff. And then you can go through and listen very closely to see if they're using the pronunciations or words you're looking for. And so I'm going to give an example because all that's pretty abstract. So I'm going to talk about one study I did and how that kind of worked out. So back in 2015, I was working with a language called Majumba in West Cameroon, and I was in a village called Bangula, and I talked to 33 people who all lived in the same village. It's not a super big village. So no geographic variation for the most part, even though some people might have moved there from elsewhere. But all these 33 people were all different ages and different genders. So I was looking at, is there variation by age and gender? And a caveat, I actually wasn't looking for variation when I first did this study. I was actually interested in how this language talks about space, but for various reasons, that study didn't work out, and I had to turn it into a variation study instead when I noticed some interesting stuff. So that's just a side note to say, don't get too discouraged if things don't go according to plan in your documentation work. That happens all the time, and you can still probably learn something super interesting. So back to that actual study. So I talked to 33 people, and all of them were shown the same set of drawings. These are called the Bowerman-Peterson images, and they're meant to get people to talk about where objects are in space. And they look like this, right? They all show something in relation to another object with a little arrow pointing to one of the things. So this one, it'd be like, where is the hat? For this one, it'd be like, where is the dog? And most people would say something like, the dog is next to the dog house, or the dog is outside the dog house, or the dog is sitting on the ground in front of the dog house, right? And in this case, I noticed something really interesting with the one that's like, where is the hat? So pretty much everybody, when I showed this picture and asked, where is the hat? Où se trouve le chapeau? Basically everyone would say on a head, on the guy's head, on a man's head, right? It always pretty much involved saying the word head. So I got 33 different people saying head. And when I was listening back through these recordings, I noticed something. When I had learned Majumba like in formal classes, I was taught that the word for head was chu with a ch sound, like in English cheese. That's how I learned it. But people were pronouncing it in four different ways in these recordings. Some people said tu with like an unaspirated T. Some people said tu with a very aspirated T. Some people said su with a TS. And then some people said chu like I had learned it. And that was really surprising to me. I had no idea there were other ways to pronounce head. And so I started looking closer, like, wait, who is saying each of these things? And when I looked closer and analyzed those patterns, it was pretty clear that there are age and gender differences in who was saying each one. So, in broad strokes, tu unaspirated was mostly said by older men. Tu aspirated was mostly said by both older men and women, so kind of grandparent aged people. Su, with just the s, was pretty much mostly being said by younger men. And then chu, the way I had learned it, was mostly used by younger people, especially women. So without knowing it, I had kind of learned the appropriate pronunciation for my own age and gender as a younger woman. And my teacher was also a younger woman. So I just thought everybody said chu. But it turns out actually, and if you're a sociolinguist, you might see something familiar here. Uh, Theoretically, when you see a new kind of pronunciation mostly used by younger women, that means the language is changing towards that pronunciation. And if we come back in 50 years, you'll probably find most people are saying chu because younger women tend to be the trend setters for language change. Often, not always, but it's a really common pattern. So if you want to read more about that, I wrote it up in that link and I'll share that. But another way to look at variation, is mapping, right? Because a lot of variation does pattern along regional lines, along geographic lines, just like the Coke soda pop thing. So you can make maps of that and they're super interesting, right? And this is like, yeah, okay, it's all basically a pink speech bubble with a blue triangle, but the individual contours of the shape and color of each thing might change a little bit, just like our individual pronunciation or grammar might change a little bit. So you can do the word list thing, the description of films or picture books, and then map out the differences in how people say the relevant stuff. You can also ask people overtly, how things are said differently in other towns, in other provinces, whatever. Because most people, again, have a pretty good intuition about that and can point you in the right direction. Like, oh, yeah, in that province, they say this thing totally differently. And it's also really important when you're doing this kind of work. Remember to ask people about their biographies if if they're comfortable talking about that, because you might just be like, "Yes, okay, man, 45, Bangulap," and just like put that dot for him in that one village. But if you actually talk to him, it might be like, "Oh yeah, he grew up 50 miles away, and then he lived in the capital for a while, and then he moved to France for a while, and now he's back here." And that, spending time in different places, can definitely affect how people talk. So if you can, also gather information about where people have lived and how that might have shaped their language. So one really cool example of this is back in the 1950s and 60s in Ireland, they made a whole atlas of variation in a bunch of different Irish words and phrases. So this is an old printed atlas showing all of the different ways they recorded people saying the phrase "I sold." And I don't speak Irish, I'm sorry, I don't want to get it wrong, but these things change over time. And so one of ELP's 2023 interns made a digital version looking at the same phrases and words as the 1950s version to see how that had changed. And this one's cool because you can actually click and listen to each different pronunciation of the phrase "I sold." So I'll also include a link to this if you want some cool examples of variation maps. Uh, and this is also a really complex topic that takes some specialized training in like statistics and sociolinguistic theory, and it is helpful to have a good guidebook for doing this. So one of my PhD advisors, Dr. Katie Drager, wrote a really nice handbook on doing variationist research like this. And if you'd like a copy, you can just email me. So finally, let's get into documenting attitudes and ideologies. And I want to start with the caveat that there is no way to get a right answer when you're doing research into attitudes and ideologies, right? This is one of the most complicated and nuanced things that you can do research into. So it's okay if your answers are always changing, your understanding of this is always changing, because that's part of what makes it so interesting. So the first thing, again, like with everything else, start with observation. And a lot of this is going to have to do with people's overt behaviors. And scolding is one of the most interesting sites for looking at language ideologies, right? Do people get rebuked if they say a certain thing or speak a certain way? And are there norms that it is not socially acceptable to break, right? Do people get in trouble if they speak pidgin in the classroom? Do people get in trouble if they're supposed to be speaking in a very formal way, but they start using Appalachian English? All those kinds of questions can give you lots of important clues into language ideology. And so can, I hate to advise anyone to read the comments section, but social media comment sections are very rich grounds for learning about language ideologies. People will post their unfiltered thoughts about other people's language use in the wildest ways and give you very juicy information about their language attitudes. But you can also look at how things are framed in the news or on TV, right? If there's like a national news broadcast, what are people saying about how people are supposed to talk? What are the ideologies baked into news, into policy, into public opinion? And you can also do some introspection, right? You can write down a list of things that you believe about language or that you believe about certain languages, right? If you ask yourself, what do I think is the best language or the prettiest language and why? And where did I get that idea? And how do I live that? That can be also really helpful for finding out about ideologies in your own community. But interviews, once you want to move past observation and start talking to people, interviews are a fantastic way to start exploring language attitudes. And this is quite different than a survey, right? With interviews, you generally want to ask pretty open-ended questions. You don't want to point the person towards what they think is like a right answer. Because a lot of people, they just want to be helpful. They want to tell you what you want to hear. So if you're like, do you think French is pretty? They'll just be like, yes. So that's not very helpful to you. As a researcher, you want to ask, what languages do you think are pretty? Or what languages do you like to hear spoken? Some of the questions I like to use are, is there a language, for example, that should always be used in the public market? Or if you could choose one language for your kids to speak perfectly, what would it be and why? And in general, interviews are a lot of fun to do because people really like to talk about their own opinions in general. And there's also a lot of good information in the ways they talk about their own opinions, right? The ways they frame things, the words they use, the examples they pick. There's lots of good information for you as a researcher there too. And if you're interested in sort of a template for these kinds of interviews, my dissertation has an example interview template, the one I used in a lot of my interviews, so you can find a copy there at that link later. All right, so just to wrap up and make sure that we have lots of time for questions, just want to reiterate that sociolinguistic documentation, like most parts of language documentation, is all about looking at relationships, right? We're looking at relationships between people, we're looking at relationships between people and languages, as well as like places, geographic areas, ideologies, identities, histories. It's all about the interplay and the relationships between all this stuff. And as always, but especially in sociolinguistic work, that means your relationships within the community and your relationships with the people you're working with are going to be extra, extra important to being able to do this work well. And so, when I was doing my dissertation, I always felt very anxious, like I was wasting time every time I just spent the evening, I don't know, hanging out at the bar talking to people. It's like, oh, this isn't research. I'm losing time. I should be doing interviews and surveys. But in hindsight, that time spent hanging out was the most important part of any of my research. Getting to know people, talking to them about their lives and their experiences and their opinions, and just listening and watching and listening as much as you possibly can is going to be really central to doing this kind of work and building strong relationships. So, once we have some idea of how to do this, the question is, why would we do this? Aside from like, it's a really cool and awesome academic research area, but it also has a lot of important real world applications, which is why I think most of us are here. We want to do something concretely useful, right? So there are a few overall places where this specific kind of documentation is super, super helpful. And number one is knowing what languages to provide crucial information and services in, right? Looking at multilingualism, having a good sense of which languages people know, which ones they feel most comfortable with, which ones they trust, can help you, for example, provide disaster relief information in a language people will actually listen to or understand, or, for example, during early COVID, ELP put together a repository of COVID public safety information in hundreds of different languages so that people who have access to those languages primarily can get the information they need. But also, it's really helpful to know how to plan language revitalization efforts around what languages people are using, how their language you're trying to revitalize varies, and what people believe about their languages and language use, right? If you want to actually design a good program, you have to understand where people are coming from and what they'll respond to, and sociolinguistic documentation can help us do that. Same thing with creating awareness and acceptance of variation, right? So let's say you're trying to do a revitalization program for your language, and there's a fair bit of regional difference in how people talk, right? Maybe people have a different word for dog in each of the 5 villages where your language is spoken. If you want to do a good revitalization project for the entire language, not just for one village, you have to help people understand that, yeah, other folks have a different word for dog. They're going to use that one. That's okay. And we're going to build that into our revitalization program. And this means it'll help you make better learning and reference materials, right? You don't want a dictionary of just how one guy in one town talks. You want a dictionary that represents how everybody uses your language, theoretically, probably, right? So if there's a lot of variation in your language, maybe your learning and reference materials will be more useful if you include that. So finally, let's get some time for questions because this is a really juicy topic. So I'd love to hear what kinds of multilingualism is in your communities. any patterns of variation you've noticed in your languages and maybe who uses them, and also some common attitudes and ideologies that you have observed in your own communities and in your own languages. I'm going to go ahead and look through the chat and see if there are any questions to get to there. Feel free to drop
Hannah,
some more in. Oh, yeah.
I took note of all the questions that popped up, so I have them to the side for you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Danica. All
No
right.
problem. The first
Um,
one was from Fernando Guzmao. In my country, Indonesia, the national language and motivation of speaker is main factor that reduces the vitality of the local language. So the heritage language, how do you handle this?
oh, great question. So, the sort of national identity and national language in most cases is going to have a trickle down effect for people's ideologies in your own community, right? A lot of people, after hearing over and over, if you're from this country, you need to use the country's language, they're going to start internalizing that, right? That's the point of telling people that over and over. And so, how do you address that when you're doing documentation? I'd say first, name it, right? Identify it, make it part of what you're studying. Talk to people about their own relationship to national languages, national language policy, and see what they actually believe, right? And does it line up closely with, sort of national statements or policies around language? Um, and also, Danica, would you mind dropping the questions at the bottom of the chat? Because it helps me to look at them in writing.
Yes, I got you. I will start posting them now.
Brilliant. But yeah, because I think everybody's language behaviors and ideologies are really closely interlinked, not just like with what's inside them. It doesn't fully come from inside you, it comes from everything you hear and interact with all around you. So actually, there's a paper of mine that looks at that in IASA communities and kind of compares like the ways people talk about their language ideologies to language ideologies from SIL, which is the main kind of like missionary linguistics organization in the area, and sort of national language policy, right? Like how many of these ideas are a melange of what people hear from the government, from SIL, from their neighbors, from teachers, whatever. So yeah, it's a really interesting question. There's lots of great research out there about nationalism and language ideologies. And feel free to email me if you have more specific questions about those. All right. I don't know who was up next. Danica, who's on the docket?
I put them in order of how they, oh
Oh,
shoot,
brilliant.
okay.
Okay.
Of how they were received, but it should be from, please pardon my pronunciation, but Sushanik Malik Adamian.
Brilliant. All right. So we've got a question about translanguaging with the definitions between dialects and languages being so blurred. This is a fascinating way to look at the spectrum of languages like that of colors. Yeah, that's a really good analogy, right? Where does blue stop and green begins? Depends on who you ask, right? Where does, I don't know, uh, I don't want to make any political claims about where languages stop and begin, but like where does Danish end and Swedish begins? Depends on who you ask, right? So what do I think about translanguaging as a concept and any other concepts that you might find useful? Ooh, great question. Translanguaging was a real bear for me as a sociolinguistic student because it requires you to look at languaging and languages in a very different way than traditional sociolinguistics. And I don't want to get too far in the weeds here. Translanguaging essentially, please correct me, it's been a long time since I studied this, but it sort of looks at language as there's no such thing as a discrete boundary around a language, right? It's again a color spectrum of stuff, and people pick and choose language resources from different places on that spectrum and cobble them together in ways that suit their needs. And it's especially a popular theory kind of in educational linguistics. What I think about it as a concept is it is very useful for describing some things, and it is less useful for describing other things, just like literally every academic framework. But I think it's really important because it brings up the fact that any hard lines between languages are artificial and usually imposed in the process of creating like national identities or delimiting groups for political or economic purposes. So I think it's important in that it foregrounds that fact. Similar concepts that y'all might find useful to know about. Ooh, that's a toughie. I'd say look at the body of work coming out in the last decade or so around small scale multilingualisms. It's like Friedrich Lübke and a bunch of other researchers who are looking at ways that societies use languages that don't line up with traditional sociolinguistic concepts of like, oh, there's a dominant language at the top and then you go down in order of prestige or whatever. No, there are language ecosystems where a lot of the languages are on even footing and they interact in like a non-hierarchical way. And I find that stuff super interesting. So look into small scale multilingualisms if you're into that. Um, and then I see the next question is kind of on this like language dialect continuum topic. How can we determine where dialects end and language begins? And do I think natural language processing could contribute to saving endangered languages? Okay, cool. Two extremely different questions. So I'll start with where do dialects end and where do languages begin? How many of y'all have heard that old saying, a language is a dialect with an army and a navy? Linguists have different feelings about this saying, but it's a very concise way of getting at the fact that language, like something being called a language versus a dialect, is often much more political than linguistic, right? It's often calling something a language as a way to elevate it to legitimacy or power or whatever, and calling something a dialect is a way to kind of like demean it or put it at a less important level or whatever, right? So that's kind of the political use of those two words. And then if you ask a linguist, there's also kind of like a linguistic definition of those terms. And the main way that linguists tend to talk about that difference is what they call mutual intelligibility. So theoretically, in broad strokes, to a linguist, a language is kind of like, in biology, a species is an animal that can't reproduce with some other animal, right? If two things can't reproduce together, they're different species. And in linguistics, if two people speaking two ways can't understand each other, they're speaking different languages. Dialects, on the other hand, people can mostly kind of understand each other, even if there are differences in how they talk, right? So that's the very broad strokes definition. But then when you get more nuanced and you look at it closer, that doesn't entirely work, right? What if you can kind of understand what the other person's saying, but you're missing a lot? What if definitely you totally understand everything they're saying, but they live in a different country and they call the language something else, right? Hindi is not Urdu because they are spoken by different countries. Danish is not Swedish because they are spoken by different countries. But if you ask people who speak those languages to talk to each other, they understand a lot of it. And so there are different like thresholds where you can put that dividing line. Some people use like 80%. If you understand 80% of what the other person is saying, it's the same language but different dialects. People fight about this a lot. So the short answer is it depends who you ask and why you're trying to measure it, but there are a lot of different ways of trying to measure it. I hope that answered your question. Let's see. Adam was next up, maybe? No, Peter. So got a question about language contact. So where a language is isolated geographically, but got influenced from neighboring languages, and languages where there's no border such that two groups easily make contact, how do we look at language ecologies in that language contact area? Ooh-wee, so that's a very complicated question. So language contact, in general, the thing where people who speak different languages live near each other, interact a bunch, maybe learn each other's languages, is one of the core questions of sociolinguistics. How do people's languages influence each other? And why does it work that way? So how do we look at those language ecologies? That's a great question. Several ways to do that. One, starting out with kind of word lists, seeing where people's vocabulary overlaps and seeing if you notice any patterns in where those differences or overlaps happen, right? So I'm just going to make up an example totally out of nowhere. Let's say we have two communities like 10 miles apart. They've been in contact for a really long time. Over here, community A, they mostly farm and they grow like potatoes and papayas and I don't know, some other stuff. And over here, community B, they do a lot of hunting. They bring in a lot of meat, maybe also some fish, stuff like that. And for a long time, they've been trading stuff, right? Like community B gets potatoes from community A gets meat from community B. It's been like that forever. You might notice that they have some overlap in like food words because that is how their contact has been happening is through exchanging food. So you can look for a lot of clues like that in language contact that tell you a little bit about the relationship between those two language communities. But when you're looking at like, oh my gosh, but what if their relationship changes? What if tensions arise? What if they decide to just like all move in together and do both hunting and farming, right? Things like that. Then you can start looking at how those influences change and how that reflects their relationships. And this is way too big a topic. I've already been talking way too much about it. But I'm happy to drop some interesting studies about language contact in the Google Drive folder. Question from Putri. I'm interested to look at morphosyntactic variation in different Malayo-Polynesian languages. Cool. And I'm trying to understand how these methods could inform work on speakers' mental representations. Ooh, I'm so curious, mental representations of what? And is it possible to use interview or storyboard approaches to get data on this? Yes, absolutely. Interviews and storyboards are great for getting data on all kinds of variation. If you're looking at a specific kind of morphosyntactic variation, you can also make your own movies or storyboards or whatever to try and get at those words or those paradigms. So when I was working with IASA, I was told that there was a really big difference in how old people and young people talk. I'll try not to get too deep into it, but I was told like basically if as an English analogy, young people make a mistake where they say like motorcycles is like they over pluralize, right? This was mostly older folks telling me this. They're like, oh, I hate hearing young people say motorcycles is. It really makes me mad. So I wanted to know if young people actually say motorcycles is in IASA. And so I filmed a short little movie with a couple of my buddies where they drove motorcycles and did some other stuff. And then I had people narrate that film to try and get them to say whatever they would say for the plural of motorcycle. And it showed some really interesting stuff. Number one, that old people were also saying motorcycles is. It wasn't just young people, it was kind of a normal change in progress. So yes, you can definitely use interviews or storyboards to look at morphosyntactic variation, and you can make your own movies and storyboards to try and get at that. From Paulin, any ways to teach basic documentation to young learners of an endangered language to further motivate them and raise their awareness about the region's language, diversity, and language rights in general? I love this question. Yes, absolutely. There are lots of good examples to follow for doing sort of like introductory documentation workshops with young folks. That was also part of my dissertation, actually. We did a documentation workshop for young people in the YASA community, and it went really well. These are really effective ways to get people thinking about their own language, about language issues. And I will send a link to an article that my colleague Samim Bibite wrote about that workshop and kind of how it worked. And if you want to know more about designing that type of workshop, please reach out. I love talking about it. Then I see a question from Ishmael. What's the difference between a dialect of the same language and language variation? Great question. Dialects are just a kind of variation, right? When we say a dialect of a language, what we're really saying is kind of like a cluster of variation patterns that tend to go together, right? So if I say like the Southern dialect of American English, what I'm really talking about is some vocabulary words that are different, some pronunciations that are different, and some grammar features that are different. And they all kind of bundle together in a way that patterns in this like geographical way, right? So people who live in this part of the US tend to have these pronunciations, these words, and these grammar structures. So a dialect is just a kind of variation or like a bundle of variations, if that makes sense. Let's see. I'm checking the chat for other questions. Looks like I think that's it. Does anybody have any other questions? And sorry, we're a little bit over time. Yeah, Peter.
I'm just curious, Dr. Anna. Here in the Philippines, Cebuano is second most spoken language. And there are different dialects of Cebuano, but prominent would be in Visayas and Mindanao. And there's this junk of a complementarity because generally the phrase anhi diri is acceptable, which means come here. But down south, in Mindanao, anhi dira is acceptable, where in fact the standard could be anhi diri adto dito, but in Mindanao, southern part, the complementarity is lost, but it's understandable.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like a pretty normal kind of just regional variation. The same way, I think with the example for me, it needs washed versus it needs to be washed, right? If people from either region heard either of those versions of saying it, they'd understand it and they might feel like, oh, that doesn't sound how I'd say it, but they absolutely understand the meaning of it. That sounds like just sort of the regular regional variation where there's total mutual intelligibility, just a
Uh-huh.
little bit of difference. Yeah.
Has it something to do with ideology? Because like down south, nobody cares, but there are a few from the Cebu, the upper, would find it really not nice. They
Mm,
really complain
yeah.
about it.
Yes, yeah. I think when you're asking yourself, does this have to do with language ideology? The answer is pretty much always yeah. Everything has to do with language ideology. And so you'll find that if I had to make a guess, and I might be wrong here, but do the people who have the more standardized version who kind of look down on the other version, are they more central to like the standard like does the standardized version of Cebuano match theirs closer? Like, was the standard developed around how they talk? Because that's also
Yeah,
really common, right?
indeed.
For example, contemporary standardized French is based on how people talked in Paris when they were standardizing French. And people in Paris had more socioeconomic power, they had more political power, and so the standard was based around how they talk. And they looked down on everybody else's French as like regional barbarism and gibberish and blah 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 because that was the way people with less power and money and stuff talked. And so oftentimes when people are very proud of speaking a standardized version, what they're proud of is speaking the version that's linked more closely with power and wealth and prestige. And so most language ideology questions have something to do oftentimes with does this community historically have more power or prestige than the ones they're looking down on the speech of? Yeah, I don't know if that quite answers your question.
Right. I understand. Thank you very much, Dr. Anna.
Yeah. Yeah. And I don't see any more questions. So last call. All right. Well, thanks everybody for being here. This was really fun. And as always, if you have questions, email me, make an appointment with the ELP Language
Mm.
Revitalization Mentors. They have so much knowledge and insight. Go talk to all of them. And next week, we're going to be having a fantastic talk from Dr. Ha'a Solomon, who will be telling us about documenting biocultural knowledge. So, all of these cool interactions between language and culture and the natural world. And it is always great. And we'll see you next week at this same time. So this is our
Oh,
new normal time because of the time change in the US.
oh, um, sorry, do you have time for a question? It's a little unrelated to this specific topic, but more about language documentation more broadly.
Yeah, sure. I can hang around for more questions. If y'all need to go, feel free to go,
Yeah.
but I can answer some more.
Yeah, so I wanted to study, I guess, like, and document like local. like Philippine languages, and when I was looking in the Journal for Oceanic Linguistics, I noticed like I went from like volume 50 something, which is the current, all the way down to a volume from 2009. And I noticed there were only two authors that I saw that were Filipino. So I guess do you think that kind of contributes to like a sort of linguistic imperialism, or are there like other things that I'm not seeing? Because I remember from one of your slide materials, you've read Decolonizing Methodologies, which like I still need to read that book, but I read through the introduction. I love it. But is there other resources in the University of Hawaii specific for, I guess, because a lot of it also seems to be more studying Indonesian uh native languages than it is like in the Philippines.
Yeah, all
Sorry, that's a
right.
lot, I
Big
feel like.
multifaceted question. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
sorry.
no, I think you've identified something really, really important, which is that a critically small number of documentation publications are authored by people from the relevant communities, and that is messed up. It is a symptom of and a contributor to the continuation of all kinds of linguistic imperialism, of, epistemic colonialism and injustice and all that really bad stuff that hopefully we are all committed to improving in language work. And a lot of that has to do with, obviously like the normal stuff, like most academic publication flows are situated within the global north and funded by and controlled by universities in the global north. And that's also to do with the fact that there just aren't enough outlets and paths for people to get training in, to complete degrees in um, linguistics, language documentation, etc. Right? It's expensive, it's time consuming. Not everybody can take 6 to 10 years to go do graduate degrees, especially in contexts where they might like have to do more pressing things.
Yeah.
And
Like,
so, how do we address this?
yeah.
We open up more
Guess,
paths to
sorry,
education. And yeah.
I guess the other part of that question, sorry if anybody else had questions, I'll try to make this fast. Did you know of any like specific professors at UHM, or any specific like journals that focus more on Austronesian linguistics specifically in the Philippines? Or does that seem to be more of a Philippine university thing?
Uh, as far as resources out of UHM, I don't know because none of my own work was in Austronesian languages, so I know that resource circle less well, but I can look into it. I would definitely say check out the work of a couple of people who are recent grads. Yeah, definitely University of the Philippines, especially UP Diliman. Their linguistics department is doing all kinds of incredible work, and definitely check out a student initiative there called the Katig Collective. They are doing a lot of this kind of critical work as well.
Sorry, could you spell that in the
Yep,
Gatig?
right in the
Oh,
chat there. Yeah. And also check out the work of a recent UH grad, Luard Zubiri, who is also looking into a lot of these sort of like decolonial linguistics questions in the Philippines specifically. I think he's now teaching at UP, perhaps, but also went to UH for one of his grad degrees. Um, but yeah, I think one of the best things to do is read and support and contribute to journals published in the countries of where the languages being described are spoken. Support academic programs as well as community-based documentation programs outside of sort of the US, Canada, Australia, Europe paradigm, because there's a lot of
yeah.
incredible work happening there, and boost those up.
Yeah, I'd love to get access to them if I maybe if I'm in the Philippines, I can walk to the campus.
Yeah,
Oh, thank you.
definitely. Any other questions? And if you are interested generally in sort of decolonial linguistic methods, I will drop some more resources in the Google Drive as well, because there's a lot of really awesome work happening there. All right. Well, in that case, thanks again, everybody. This was a lovely time, and we will see you next week. Happy Halloween if that's a thing where you live, and talk to you next Friday. All right. Take care, y'all.
Thank you.